You compose a difficult message to someone you care about. You type it out, delete half of it, and try again until the words perfectly match what you want to say. But the moment you hit send, you read it back, and suddenly it doesn't look quite right. You realize the person on the other end could read it in a completely different tone than you intended. That specific modern anxiety taps into a centuries-old philosophical assumption called the metaphysics of presence. For most of Western history, thinkers operated on the belief that spoken intention is pure. When you speak, your mind is physically there to back up your words, to clarify your tone, and to guarantee their meaning. Within this traditional framework, writing was treated as the lesser, second-class copy of speech. From Plato to Rousseau, philosophers viewed the written word as a dangerous addition. It is detached. It is a dead inscription that wanders away from its author, leaving it vulnerable to misinterpretation. Because of this history, we naturally view the gap between what we mean and what someone else hears as a structural failure. We judge our communication against a baseline that expects perfect telepathic transmission of thought from one brain directly into another. In the fall of 1966, the academic landscape was dominated by a French intellectual movement called structuralism. The pitch was highly appealing. Meaning didn't require a conscious author or a divine creator. Instead, meaning was produced entirely by a neat scientific system of differences. A word simply meant what it meant because it differed from other words in the network. The humanities departments of America gathered at Johns Hopkins University to be introduced to this reigning framework. A 36-year-old Algerian-born philosopher stepped in as a last-minute substitute. His name was Jacques Derrida, and over the course of a single lecture, he dismantled the entire system. This diagram represents how Derrida viewed the problem. He pointed out that every actual structuralist analysis quietly relied on a hidden foundation, a center. It could be God, presence, or the concept of structure itself. Whatever it was, this privileged center acted as an anchor. It held the rules of the system together without actually having to play by those rules itself. Removing that fixed, unquestioned point allows the network of signs to drift and overlap. Derrida called this approach deconstruction. By showing that the center must sit outside the play of differences to ground them, he revealed that structuralism's claim to have dissolved metaphysics was an illusion. Derrida's lecture showed that even the most scientific models of the 20th century still relied on the same demand for a fixed point that the philosophical tradition had always used to anchor the truth. Derrida's response was to look at the historical hierarchy of language and flip it upside down. The tradition argued that writing was inherently flawed because it lacked an author and couldn't control how it was received. Derrida argued those aren't flaws of writing, those are the baseline conditions of language as such. This animation demonstrates Derrida's concept of difference, a term he coined to describe a double movement in language. Words signify based on how they differ from other words, but their meaning is also constantly deferred. It is suspended across time, forced to wait for whatever words come next in the sentence to provide a context. This suspension applies across the board, even in your own internal monologue, where you seem to hear yourself think in real time. There is a tiny, irreducible split between the part of you that speaks and the part of you that hears. Full self-presence, that ideal state where an idea is instantly and perfectly understood without any mediation, has never existed. In the 1970s, this philosophical rebellion matched the cultural whiplash of Paris, an environment defined by the aggressive dismantling of inherited authority. In this atmosphere, Derrida expanded on how signs actually function. Derrida introduced a new rule called iterability. A written mark or a spoken sound only functions as a sign if it can be repeated. The word cat has to mean the same thing if it's written on a completely different page, lifted from its original moment and read by a complete stranger. When you say, "I'll be there," your intention does not travel inside the sentence. The moment you speak, you lose mastery over the words. This gap between speaker and listener is the exact mechanism that makes language possible. If a sign was permanently chained to its original context, it wouldn't be a sign. This leads to his most misunderstood assertion: there is nothing outside the text. Critics frequently claim Derrida was denying reality, implying the physical world is just an illusion. He meant nothing of the kind. The world absolutely exists. There are physical bodies, prisons, and wars. But nothing reaches human consciousness unmediated. Every object and every fact we encounter is filtered through a system of signs that dictates exactly what we are capable of registering about it. You can accept all the mechanics of deconstruction and still feel that something essential is missing from this picture. The most substantial objection points out that while Derrida successfully mapped the structural limits of philosophical certainty, he mistook that intense anxiety for the truth of everyday communication. The clearest antithesis comes from the Austrian-born philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. For Wittgenstein, meaning isn't some hidden architecture floating behind our words. Meaning is simply what people do with words. He argued that words are practical tools, and their definitions are stabilized by what he called a form of life. We have shared public practices. We don't exist as isolated decoders of abstract rules. We participate in a communal reality where speakers and listeners have public criteria for whether something has been said sincerely, badly, or ironically. In actual lived experience, the structural possibility of misinterpretation is closed daily. It is closed by the pragmatic, ongoing work of human interaction. Which brings us back to that difficult message you sent to someone you love. Structurally, Derrida is right. You cannot bypass language. You cannot force your pure, unfiltered intention directly into another person's mind. But when you exchange a difficult message with a loved one, you are not two strangers trading context-free signs in a void. You share years of conversation and mutual knowledge of each other's patterns. The active process of asking for clarification and repairing a breach builds the shared reality we call meaning. This unclosable distance between what is said and what is heard allows room for human care, conversation, and the work of staying in a relationship.